In early August 1974, I set off from Albany, California with my friend Matt Cook on a road trip. We circled the country, imposed on friends, ate dubious meals, and had many adventures. Here's the story. In the late 60s and early 70s, both Matt and I were fans of Car and Driver magazine, which had a reputation for irreverence when it came to articles, editorial opinion, and sponsored activities. At about that time, the Sports Car Club of America established a car racing class called Showroom Stock Sedans, aimed at low-budget weekend racer types. The cars allowed were stock versions of the then popular subcompact cars, Ford Pintos, Chevy Vegas, Honda Civics, and the like. The cars could not be modified from standard, except for a roll bar and a racing harness for the driver. They could use radial tires, but only if they were an option on the cars at the dealer. Car and Driver sponsored one of these races every year in Lime Rock, Connecticut, and challenged their readers to race against various members of the magazine's staff. These races were always written up in the magazine as basically an all-day party, and it looked like a lot of fun. Matt and I joked around about going to Lime Rock and watching a race. That's watching, not participating. And over the course of several months, in early 1974, the conversations became more serious until we finally said, why not? We were in our early 20s, working menial jobs. I was working at this liquor store in Berkeley, without serious connections to anyone or any place. And I owned Moby Dick, a 1961 ex-post office step van, which I had turned into a camper-type vehicle, with counters and cabinets, a Coleman stove, and an icebox. And orange shag carpeting, of course. A previous owner had painted a tree or a grapevine all over the outside, with spiders and airplanes and various other objects caught in it. Not exactly low profile. Just before this time, I'd gotten my hands on a 318 cubic inch V8 out of a Dodge station wagon, because the original slant 6 and push-button automatic in the truck had given up the ghost on a camping trip in the Sierras, requiring a tow home using a length of discarded spring steel cable and some hapless in-laws, but that's another story. I pulled the engines and transmissions out of both vehicles, and with some help fashioned a way to mount the V8 in the van. One small issue: since the van was designed as an around-town mail-toting vehicle carrying heavy loads with a small engine, the rear axle ratio was quite high, 4.9 to 1, meaning the engine made almost 5 rotations for every 1 turn of the rear tires. Most cars are 2 or 3 to 1 ratios, as this chart shows. What this meant in practical terms was that with the V8 engine, acceleration was great, but top speed was limited. The engine was really screaming at 60 miles an hour. Of course, you didn't want to go faster than that anyway, because the wheelbase was so short and the van was so tall that high-speed stability was questionable at best. But with the engine swap made, new tires and brakes, and some supplies laid in, we quit our jobs, gave up our apartment, and set off late on the evening of August 8, 1974, east on Interstate 80, then north on 505 out of the Bay Area. We only made it as far as the Dunnigan Red Stop that first night. We were both tired out and getting ready to go, and it was late when we started. We got out early the next morning and headed north on Interstate 5. We wanted to get to Ashland, Oregon and check out the Shakespeare Festival. On I-5, somewhere around Red Bluff, we made our first stop for gas and paid 65.9 cents per gallon, the highest price we'd see on our whole trip. 39.9 was more common. We pulled into Ashland, home of the Oregon Shakespearean Festival, and set up camp and got tickets to see Two Gentlemen of Verona. Since it was the last minute, we didn't get seats together, but the show was great. I remember how surprised I was that I could understand what was going on so well. Nothing like good acting and staging to make Shakespeare accessible. After that, we zipped north on I-5 to the Portland area, where my family lived and I grew up. We stayed with my mom in her apartment above the tropical fish shop she owned with my sister Liz. We visited my friend Charlie Pyatt. who is now a respectable and well-known potter in the Portland area, but at the time was living a slightly more bohemian lifestyle. We took a camping trip with my brother-in-law Bob Hunt to the Mount Jefferson Wilderness area in Central Oregon. We hiked to several different lakes and campsites in the area. Matt's girlfriend Nancy and her friend Carol were also driving east in a VW Bug at the same time and met us in Portland. We spent a day at the Oregon coast and then drove east with them as far as Multnomah Falls in the Columbia Gorge, where we said goodbye. And returned to Portland after a brief interruption when a rubber section of the van's gas line from the tank to the motor broke. Fortunately, there was enough slack that I could stretch the rubber line to the metal portion, clamp it down, and we were on our way. Back in Portland, we picked up Charlie and his girlfriend Lucy and drove them up to Olympic National Park in Washington. We dropped them there and spent the night on Bainbridge Island across the bay from Seattle. The next day, we rode the ferry across the bay, walked around Seattle a bit, and then headed east toward Spokane, Washington. It was 1974 after all, and there was a World's Fair going on in Spokane, Expo 74. We stopped at a campground near Spokane, but they wanted $17 a night for a campsite. We asked if there were any alternatives, and the guy said, well, there's a bunch of people camping for free down at the park, but it's kind of weird. Sounded perfect to us. We fit right in. Check out the solar showers, in 1974 no less. And it was the only campsite I've ever stayed in where there was a vendor selling weed door to door. And that's where we stayed for a couple of days while we toured Expo 74. After that, we headed north to Canada, crossing the border at Eastport, just north of Bonners Ferry, Idaho. We were a little worried about making the crossing. Of course, this was the 70s, way before any of the current paranoia, but still, we weren't exactly your standard tourists. Two Canadian border guys came out. One talked to me while the other one walked around the truck. When he came back to the driver's window, he said, I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you. I thought we were in trouble. You've got a leak in your left rear tire. What? I jumped out and stuck my head underneath. Sure enough, a steady hissing sound was coming from the tire. I explained that we didn't have a spare, and they said that there was a repair shop about 6 miles further north on the same road. Maybe we could make it. We jumped in and roared off, thinking we'd just discovered a way to get through border crossings quickly. We made it to the shop, got the leak plugged, and set up camp in Cranbrook, BC. We spent the next few days touring southern Canada, the highlights. This little spot on Canadian Highway 3, where, in 1903, the whole side of a mountain came down and buried the town of Frank, Alberta. We stopped to look around, and when we came back to the truck, we watched a car approach on the highway. It was a big old station wagon with what looked like a typical family in it. They pulled off in the parking area, the driver jumped out, took a picture of the sign, jumped back in, and roared off down the road. Just like that, just that fast. We had a good laugh about it. On to Lethbridge, Alberta, where we met a couple of Canadian guys, Ty and Barney, who were touring in their old converted school bus they had named Unabago. We hung out with them for an evening of bar hopping in Lethbridge. It was a very short evening. Then on through the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. Very pretty in the fall. Next was Riding Mountain National Park. We stayed at a campground on Moon Lake in the park and saw some bison. Then it was on to Brandon and Winnipeg, Manitoba, then back to the U.S. through International Falls, Minnesota. While we were still in Canada, we stopped for some groceries. We were trying to spend our Canadian money before we left the country. We had one bill that was stamped turnabout. We didn't know what it meant, but we gave it to the clerk. She had spotted us as Americans, and as soon as we gave her the bill, she looked at it and said, "This is counterfeit, you know." We were at a loss for words. She continued, "It's not any good." We were stammering about using another bill and explaining that we didn't know when she laughed and said she was kidding. A million laughs, those Canadians. We had much more trouble getting back into the U.S. than we had leaving. The U.S. border guys were very interested in our truck and what we'd been up to in Canada. They shook out our floor mats and checked our pockets. They were looking for marijuana, of course. We were glad that none of the hitchhikers we'd picked up had dropped anything. because the border guard said that if they found any seeds or other signs, they'd take the truck in the back and disassemble it to see if we were smuggling. All I was worried about was the case of Canadian beer I had hidden all over the truck so I could avoid paying import tax on it. He didn't find any of that, or he didn't care, and he didn't find anything else, so we were on our way to see Matt's mom in Chicago. We camped a night or two in Wisconsin, and I discovered that the right front leaf spring on the truck had several broken leaves. As a matter of fact, only the main leaf was intact, all the others had split in two. We limped into Chicago and got permission to work on the truck in the parking lot of the Baha'i Temple. That's where Matt's mom worked. I pulled the old spring off and took it to a junkyard. They rebuilt it for $25. One night we went and saw Otis Rush at the Peanut Barrel nightclub in Chicago. While we were sitting at the bar, I noticed an attractive blonde sitting next to Matt and chatting with him. I couldn't hear anything, and after a few moments she got up and left. Matt turned to me and said, "A hooker. I thought I was doing really well with her until she told me her rates." Our next objective was Ohio. I had decided to stop and see my ex-girlfriend Marie, who was in a graduate program at Oberlin College. Probably not a good idea. She hadn't been my ex for long enough yet, so it was kind of painful. One night there and back on the road, slightly depressed. Things didn't get much better. We rolled across Ohio and Pennsylvania and headed for Boston, where Matt's girlfriend Nancy lived. Remember? Portland, Multnomah Falls. She was supposed to go with us to the car race. Yeah, well, when we got there, late at night, she wasn't his girlfriend anymore. One of the problems in the pre-internet cell phone text messaging days, no warning about this stuff. We spent the night parked in a very dubious spot, sleeping in a truck, and got out of town soon. Matt had some friends in Fishkill, New York. It was close, so we dropped in on them. They did a good job of giving us some perspective, and since it was getting close to the date of the car and driver race, we called Matt's friend Sharon Elliott, who was living in Brooklyn, to see if she wanted to go with us to the race. She did, so we drove down to Brooklyn, picked her up, and headed for Lime Rock, Connecticut. The race was fun, although my memory is a little hazy because there was a beer tent at the race where you could get free beer. I think I had 12 or 13 by the end of the day. Yeah, Matt drove when we left. We stopped for the night at Bennington College, where Sharon had gone, and she visited friends. Matt got involved with a cat stuck up on a tree and a can of tuna, but I'm hazy on the details. We took Sharon back to Brooklyn and stayed there a while. We helped her move from her small walk-up apartment to one at her aunt and uncle's place in Brooklyn Heights. On Matt's birthday, October 16th, we went to a local theater which just happened to be playing The Born Losers, a 60s biker movie in which Matt's father had a fairly big part. And that was about the only redeeming feature of the movie, which was the first film to feature the character Billy Jack. We did a lot of the standard New York things, like the Statue of Liberty. It is very small up in the Crown, but the view is good. We rode the subways around, had a great time. Sharon noted afterward, in a letter to his sister, that guy Doug Fuller would make someone a good husband someday, but not me. Wrong. We left New York in early November and headed south, stopping for a few days in Washington, D.C. We originally thought we'd tour the Smithsonian in one day. Ha! It took one day to get through one building of the museum. Of course, we looked at a lot of cars. We found this empty display case off in the corner of one building, so Matt jumped in. I tried to memorize the Gettysburg Address at the Lincoln Memorial. And we saw a lot of other things in D.C., and then kept moving south. I remember getting up one morning in South Carolina, and it was actually warm, the first warm weather we'd had for a while. I took a nap on a concrete picnic table while Matt made breakfast. We continued on into Florida, stopping at Daytona Beach to check the beach cruising scene, and then on into Miami. A little problem here. As we were driving south on Biscayne Boulevard, I hit the gas at a green light, and the right motor mount let go. The engine torqued up, and the fan contacted the radiator, made a 3/4 turn, and gashed out a big track. All the water pumped out on the ground, and there we were. No sweat. Pulled out the radiator. Found a piece of plastic pipe lying in the gutter, attached one end of it to the bottom hose, filled the engine with water, and clamped the other hose on top. We then drove to a motel, $9 a night as I remember, rode the bus to the radiator shop and had the gas pipe sealed off. That only left about 5 inches on each side of the radiator that water could flow through, but it was enough to keep the motor from overheating. While we were in Miami, we couldn't help but notice all the signs for cruises. They were everywhere. AAA has a huge travel center in Miami because of all the cruises, so just for the heck of it, we went in and talked to one of the agents. Long story short, we booked a cruise over Thanksgiving on the MS Starwood for a week in the Caribbean. Since it was only a week ahead of time, there wasn't space, but they guaranteed we'd get on the ship because of cancellations. We paid the minimum fare, I think it was $289, and waited to see what we'd get. In the meantime, we hit every Goodwill store we could find because you had to wear jackets and ties after 6 on the ship, and we didn't have anything like that with us, and no luggage either. I think we spent about $20 a piece for 2 suits and a suitcase each. We just dropped the stuff back in the Goodwill collection box when the week was over. The AAA agent thought that was so funny. He said we'd be on the cruise ship with a bunch of old ladies traveling on their dead husband's money, and we'd be wearing their dead husband's clothing. He wasn't far wrong. Other than kids traveling with parents, I think we were the youngest people on the ship. When we showed up on the departure day, we got a cabin here, when the minimum fare cabins were here. We had a great time. We went to Haiti, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. One of the first days at sea, they had us out on deck for a lifeboat drill. We walked around Port-au-Prince, Haiti. It's kind of a depressing place, very poor. A local named Fritz, so he said, attached himself to us as a tour guide, but dropped off when we didn't buy anything at any of the places he took us. No commissions. We rented a car and picked up hitchhikers all day in one Jamaican stop and rented a sailboat in another. They snapped our picture one evening in the ship's lounge. I can't believe we allowed ourselves to be seen in public looking like this, but there we were. We rented motor scooters in Nassau and rode them around Grand Bahama Island. But mostly, we ate. Non-stop food on cruise ships, and Matt and I had been living out of a camper for 3+ months. All of a sudden, there was food available practically all the time. I gained 10 pounds that week, at a time in my life when it was very difficult for me to gain weight. Breakfast, morning snack, lunch, afternoon snack, dinner, midnight buffet. We hit it all and hit it hard. I think we ate enough to take care of the fare. In the dining room, it was assigned seating. We were at a table for 6 with 2 couples, Abe and Sylvia, and Abe and Bobby, from New York. As our story came out during the week, they were more and more amazed. By the end, they were sorry we'd already been to New York. They wanted us to visit. There was nightly entertainment on the ship also. Back in Miami, we dumped the clothes and drove down to Key West, then back up, across the Everglades, and up the west coast of Florida. Here we are at a campsite on the Florida Panhandle, west of Tallahassee. Our next stop was Bourbon Street in New Orleans, which I remember as sort of like Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley in drag. We checked out a few places, but didn't find it to be that great. From there, we drove north to Jackson, Mississippi, where Matt's grandparents lived. Here, I made more substantial repairs to the motor mount, using a turnbuckle to hold the motor onto the mount so it didn't jump around anymore. I'd been taking it real easy on the gas for a while. We spent a few days in Jackson and at Matt's great-uncles Hartwell and Aunt Zosie's place outside of town. It was a bit of a culture shock. Needless to say, we had to keep our Northern California attitudes about certain subjects pretty much to ourselves. Wonderful people, but a very narrow view of the world. In one of the more bizarre scenes I remember from the trip, we went to Hartwell's ranch outside Jackson. He had a rambling old farmhouse, a few head of cattle, his girls he called them, and, wait for it, a tennis court. Oh, he and Zosie didn't play tennis, they just wanted to have a tennis court. They insisted that Matt and I play. They had a little cabinet with rackets and balls, so Matt and I hit the ball back and forth a few times. They loved it. Very strange. Out of Jackson, we crossed into Texas at Shreveport, Louisiana, and spent the next 3 days driving across the Lone Star State. Some highlights: a lot of long, straight road. A side trip to see the official state herd of longhorn cattle. This great marker, it says, second largest mesquite tree in the United States. And this tribute to good grammar. We cut across into New Mexico and stopped at Carlsbad Caverns. You know, I've never been able to figure out which way this picture goes. What do you think? Then we rolled into El Paso, Texas late one afternoon and faced a dilemma. The nearest decent campground that might have some room was in Columbus, New Mexico, which on the map looked to be a couple hours drive west of El Paso, but the freeway went way north and then back down again, so we decided to take the direct route. However, that turned out to be a washboard dirt road. We left El Paso at sunset and didn't get to Columbus until 2 or 3 in the morning. The road was so rough I couldn't go more than 10 miles an hour, and even with that, parts were vibrating off the truck. Both mufflers fell off and had to be wired back on. Not a fun drive. But there we were next morning cooking breakfast. Unfortunately, the battery in the truck was dead because we'd been driving so slowly that the alternator wasn't keeping a charge on the battery. We were a little hesitant to ask the guy next to us for a jump start because he had this sticker in his window. I frankly don't remember how we got the truck started, but we did. The campground in Columbus was right next to the place where General Pershing, in 1915, used trucks and airplanes to try and chase down Pancho Villa, the first time they were used in an American military operation. Next stop, Tombstone, Arizona, the OK Corral and other tourist sites. We got back on the interstate for this leg of the trip. Then we angled across Arizona to the Grand Canyon. Yep, look closely and you'll see an 8-track tape player mounted on the shelf directly in front of me. State-of-the-art 1974. Here I am, a ways down the trail into the Grand Canyon. It was December and a bit chilly. Note the frost on the ground. Here's an early morning shot of a 2 sleeping bag night. You know it's cold when you have to put one sleeping bag inside the other to stay warm. Leaving the Grand Canyon, we arrived in Las Vegas and stayed just long enough to catch Linda Ronstadt and Loggins and Messina at the Sahara Space Center Hotel. As I remember, we were much more interested in Linda, but Loggins and Messina had a better show. Out of Vegas, we headed toward Death Valley, and it was in the little town of Pahrump that I noticed a little squeak, squeak, squeak whenever the truck started and stopped. Although the truck made a lot of noises, something told me to check this one out. On a hunch, I pulled out the driveline, and sure enough, one of the U-joints was dry, as a bone. We were actually able to match the old joint up to one at a local auto parts store, and we were on our way again, over the mountains and into Death Valley. Here we are at the parking lot near the lowest point in the U.S., 282 feet below sea level, U-joints intact. Out of Death Valley, down Interstate 15, past the famous Zizix Road, and into L.A. on the way to visit Matt's father, Ed. You remember, the Born Losers? Moby Dick had one more surprise for us. Pulling onto the Harbor Freeway south, the right front spindle, that's the part of the front suspension that holds the bearings and supports the brake drum, wheel, and tire, decided it had had enough and snapped. The truck dropped down on the axle, and the tire, wheel, and brake drum continued on down the freeway. I managed to wrestle the truck over to the shoulder, and Matt jumped out and chased down the rolling parts. AAA towed us to Ed's house in Redondo Beach, and the next day we found a replacement spindle in a pile of axles at a local junkyard for, you guessed it, $25. We stayed in Redondo for a few days, ate a free Christmas dinner at Barney's Beanery in Hollywood, and then drove back up Interstate 5 to the Bay Area, arriving just before New Year's. 5 months, 10,000 miles, 31 states, Canada, Jamaica, Haiti, and the Bahamas. I highly recommend it. I'd suggest a somewhat less used vehicle, however. Just a suggestion.